All right, let's say our La'asok B'divrei Torah blessing together. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Praise to you, Lord our God, rule of the universe, who has made us holy with your commandments and commanded us to busy ourselves with the words of Torah. So, this evening we are taking on the Tower of Babel. This is a depiction of it, not from an eyewitness, but from 1594, Lucas van Valkenborg, who is a Flemish painter. And if you go to Paris, you can find this there as well, in the Louvre. All right, so we begin with a Jewish joke. How do we know that the Tower of Babel was unfinished because they ran out of money? Answer, it's in chapter 11.
Ouch.
All right. Doris, would you read the Tower of Babel in 1 foot, please?
Sure. The Tower of Babel is the Bible's explanation for why we have multiple languages. There are those who consider it a Jewish myth. The story may be based on the Mesopotamian ziggurats, which were considered places where heaven and earth met, and also had the name in Babylonian inscriptions as the place with its top in the sky. After the Hittite raid on Babylon around 1600 BCE, its main ziggurat was in ruins in such a way that it appeared to be unfinished. The Hebrew word for Babel is the same as the Hebrew word for Babylon. Some see this as a commentary of one sort or another about the Babylonians.
Thank you. All right, so now that I've given away the story, kind of, I apologize if you weren't familiar with it. Now we will get into it. Diane, would you read Act 1, please?
Everyone sorry.
Did you say Diane?
Yes, Diane, please.
Oh, okay.
Everyone on earth had the same language and the same words. And as they migrated from the east, they came upon a valley in the land of Shinar and settled there. They said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them hard." Bricks served them as stone, and bitumen served them as mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build a city and a tower with its top in the sky, to make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered all over the world."
Okay, and some context, please, and then our first question.
This is from the biblical book of Genesis, right after the Noah's Ark story. That story, the page shifted on me. That story ends with God telling Noah and his family to fill the earth, Genesis 9:7. Note that this story shows evidence of real knowledge because, as the Etz Chaim points out, did I say that right?
Yep.
The phrase with bitumen and burnt brick is a standard phrase in Babylonian building inscription, and it is a different form of building than the stone construction used in the land of Israel. Question number 1. History and stories are not inevitable. People and authors make choices. At what points could this part of the story have turned out differently?
Thank you. All right. Here's our first part of the story. At what points could it have been different?
They didn't build a city with a tower.
And then they wouldn't have made a name for themselves. And maybe then they would have been scattered all over.
So who were these people? Were they descendants of Abraham?
That's a fair question. This is before Abraham. These are all descendants of Noah.
Okay. So Noah had that many descendants. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I said, so Noah had that many descendants just from his sons and daughters?
Yeah, Noah had 3 sons who each had wives at the time of the flood. And by this point, we're looking at somewhere in the 10 generations between Noah and Abraham.
Okay.
You know, on the Oregon coast, Howard and I stayed in a home that's like a bed and breakfast place, and the name of it was Ziggurat. And it was made in the shape that they have just described. It was very unusual. The guy was a professor at the University of Oregon, and he also rented out 2 rooms in this place. And that was the only other time I'd ever seen that word used.
Cool.
I suppose it could have changed if they had either migrated in a different direction, because the materials would have been different. And did they migrate to a place where they saw the ziggurats? Or I'm assuming that's the case, and that's why they decided to build it in that shape, because they would have seen something differently.
Right. So this text, in total, between the 2 acts, it's a 9-verse story. Before everything up to what I gave you everything up to what I gave you is not part of the story insofar as you can say that anything is separate from anything else in the Torah. So within the evidence of the text itself, it does not say that they saw a ziggurat and they decided to build it. It is possible that what is being described here is that they built a ziggurat, but
no,
yeah.
I'm sorry. I interrupted you. I didn't realize that.
That's okay.
Go ahead. No, I realized the ziggurat wasn't in the text, but
yeah.
I assumed somebody got that idea because of the region where this kind of comes from and the surrounding part. But so I was thinking if they migrated a different direction, they would have, seen something else or associated with different people or whatever. So they would have changed their idea or had a different motivation for something.
Yes, and they also, what you said earlier is also true, that they would have had different building material available to them because the Babylonians who lived in this area were the first ones to come up with bricks because of the natural materials that they had available for making building materials or for building stuff with.
No, the same as the Egyptians. We have the story from that when we were slaves in Egypt, we were making the bricks out of clay and throwing some straw in it. We're speaking about Chile. That was something I saw when I was a volunteer in the 60s in Chile on some of the countryside farms. Same thing. Of course, then they used cement for mortar, but they made the bricks themselves by mixing the bit of clay in the land. They had the horses pull the plows around them. Well, I'm sorry, I don't want to get off, but I was just thinking of the same thing. And if we can imagine what it meant for folks to make bricks then.
Wouldn't things have been different had they followed his written instructions? They're instructed to go all over the place. Instead, they all congregated.
That's true.
Things might have been different if they had followed the end of chapter 10, where there are all these different nations and their own languages, and then all of a sudden we have them all as one nation. It's very striking how we go immediately from an explanation of spreading out different peoples to having this different story.
Yes. So you noticed something that the rabbis noticed. And lest everybody feel like I would not have told you about this detail, it is coming up in question 8. But let's talk about it now. So previously in chapter 10, we hear that each of Noah's sons becomes the ancestor of a number of nations, and these nations all go off with their languages and fill the land. And then in chapter 11, we hear that all of a sudden everybody's all together and they're all speaking the same language.
No, they said a group. It's just as they immigrated, everyone on earth had the same language, and as they migrated from the east, oh, I see, everyone on earth. All right.
So the other thing that it talks about in chapter 10 is that there's this guy Nimrod who is, quote, the first mighty man on earth, and he becomes the ruler of several places, including Babel, which is the same Hebrew word as this tower, and also Shinar, which is where these people end up. So you now have the same information that the rabbis had. Come up with a midrash, make an explanation as to how we go from people speaking different languages all over the place to all of a sudden everybody is speaking the same language and together. And you can use Nimrod or you don't have to use Nimrod. But let's be creative here for a moment.
Well, it doesn't say how long it took them to come together and start speaking one language. It could have been many years.
That's true.
But the sons went off in the different generations. It doesn't, am I mistaken or I'm misinformed? That doesn't necessarily mean they were speaking different languages.
It does say explicitly that they spoke different languages.
Right.
Can I contribute a mythological approach to this?
Sure.
That, yes, there were various nations speaking various languages all over what passed for the ancient world in those days. But I think, if my memory serves me correctly, I think that whoever was settled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which is where Babylonia grew, that was stable settlement that with a shared language for a much longer period of time than most of the surrounding peoples of other corners of the Middle East, not to mention beyond the Middle East, in North Africa and Southeastern Europe and Southwestern Asia. So it's really almost, if my theory is correct, it's almost two completely different stories. The earlier story in chapter 10 makes sense with trying to explain why there were so many different kinds of people speaking so many different kinds of language after the primordial flood. But it's like coning in to one specific geographic area, which arguably has one of the most ancient things on Earth that we can begin to call a civilization. And it's like the spotlight has been panning over the whole stage, and now it's just on one piece of the center of the stage, and that piece would be Babylonia.
We know where Shinar was.
We don't know for sure where Shinar was, but we know from chapter 10 that Babylon and 3 other neighboring areas were in the land of Shinar. So we can assume that Shinar equals where Babylon was.
Okay.
All right, let's pose another question. So, based on this text, does this seem like a good use of, in this case, brick building technology?
Oh, it would be if they weren't in a hurry to build up this thing. But if they were really in a hurry to reach the sky, maybe they should have listened to Jack and gotten a few beans and planted them.
David,
Yeah.
I probably came in late, so I'm not sure if you covered that, but didn't they build the tower because they wanted to see if they could fight against God? Did you mention that?
I did not, because right now we're working with the actual text and not midrash.
Oh, so that's a medrash. That's not an actual.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we've got our text is in two acts because it's only 9 verses long. So right now we're looking at verses 1 through 4, which hopefully you can see on the screen.
Yes. Okay. I just wanted to make sure that maybe I missed it. Okay.
Yep. Nope.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
According to the midrash, as I heard it, they weren't thinking of fighting God. God just assumed that's what they were going to do if they reached heaven with the thing, and that's why he turned things around.
It depends on the midrash. You can find one saying one thing, and you can find one saying another thing.
Well, I guess I only heard one of the two.
I'm curious of the last thing it says at the end. It says that you build us a city and tower at the top of the sky, lest we be scattered all over the world. So are you building the city and the tower to keep everybody in one place to concentrate rather than become dispersed? Is that just to attract people, or just something to keep everybody focused on one particular project to maintain unity, which wouldn't be unusual even today in public policy?
Well, I'll throw it to the group. What do you think? Why would building a city and a tower with its top in the sky keep them from being scattered all over the world?
They could see the tower from any place they were in the world, and they could come to it, if just out of curiosity, if nothing else.
Come to Empire State Building.
You know, it's funny. I think of this text every single time I read about a new skyscraper that's taller than anything that's ever been built. And I think there's a new one and I forget where it is now. I mean, I thought Petronas Tower was still the highest ones, and that's been eclipsed several times already over the last several years. And, you know, not because I think of it in a religious sense per se, but I'm afraid of heights. I always notice when a really huge tower is. And I think of this, and it's interesting because that's what they say. They always say, let's make a name for ourselves so that people will know us. And that's exactly the reason reason they always build these towers in these cities. It's so they establish themselves as like some mighty power even today. And I think maybe that's it. You know, if somebody could, wow, if somebody can build a tower that big, then they must really be somebody to be kind of feared and respected, and maybe somebody we want to do business with. And I mean, it's kind of like a, I suppose, a calling card in a way.
Since Otis hadn't invented elevators yet, I don't even know how they got up to the top of the tower to build even higher.
Well, tall is a relative term, right?
And that, you know,
Yes,
that
it is.
might, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt her.
It's okay, Charles, you're the engineer. How would they get up to those high places?
No, but I'm saying maybe I was going to suggest that maybe the form of the building there was because you did, as you said, you didn't have elevators. So you had to have something that, you know, you could go up in some sort of incline or step. So that's, so you have a shape of a ziggurat rather than just a tall, slender column or building as we have today. Because how could you get up there? It's just your.
By the time you climbed up there, you'd be too tired to work.
Well, then you would stay up there. I mean, didn't some of these, they had these hanging guards, you had plateaus at different levels there, and you maybe you didn't go
That's
down.
true. That's true.
I think there's a criticism of Babylon in this story, that it was so arrogant that it wanted to be seen as being from the heavens, you know, to be seen from all the nations of the world and to dominate them.
Yeah, look at the Sears Tower. What happened to arrogance there? They went out of business. They sold the tower. Goodbye.
Didn't help them, did it?
All right. So Rashi, who is a commentator in the 1000s from France, he notices that the story begins by saying that not only did everybody have the same language, they had the same words. And presumably, if the Torah isn't just saying they had the same language, but it's also adding they had the same words, that extra phrase means something slightly different. So my question to you would be, what are the advantages of everybody having the same words and possibly the same thoughts? And what are the disadvantages?
One advantage is they presumably understood each other whenever they spoke. The words only would have one meaning, I would guess.
I would have two observations. One, from my experience I was going to mention my experience in Spanish, but the same in English. If you go from, we have some friends from England, and we supposedly speak different variations of English, but their vocabulary is different than mine, and sometimes we don't understand each other. Yes, the words that are used are different. Are you going to take the tube, or are you going to take the subway, for example? I can give you a series of other things. I just can't recall right now. The same in my experiences in Spanish, in my travels, my work, from one country to another, the language, the terms are different. And in some places, can I give you a lift? Depending on the words you used, I would, if you're from someplace else, it might be considered a vulgarity. So
What does it mean to queue up?
Well, we stand in line and in England, they stand online.
Right.
Or they queue up. We line up.
Yeah.
But then we're not using the same words. We have the same language, but not the same words.
Right.
If I may, David, you made a your question was two-sided, right? The advantages and disadvantages. And I believe that if everyone speaks the same languages or have unison idea, the same idea, that kind of stifles innovation as well.
Yeah, groupthink.
Even if they have the same language, do they have the same accents? Because different accents make them hard to understand each other.
Even travelers from different parts of the states.
All right. Is there a benefit to Jews if we could all speak one language?
I think so. That would give us a more easily accessible literary, cultural kind of experience, especially on like the day-to-day level. Because I mean, languages, they phrase like things differently that kind of express the way that they think of like culture, like things in their society, like time, for example. There's certain ways that different languages I've read about have like expressed concepts of time that are like entirely different from one another, and that can kind of give a more unifying experience to like living life.
David, did you mean if all the Jews had the same language, or do you mean if all the world had the same language?
Jews.
It would probably it might go very badly. Typically, you know, liking someone is easier if you don't know too much about them.
I think it's a tremendous advantage to a people that has spread out over the world, that we can do business, for instance. Even in medieval times, it was a tremendous advantage to the Jews who wanted to trade with the peoples in all the known world, that they could communicate.
Absolutely.
All right. So on the flip side, would there be a detriment to American Jews if the whole world only spoke English and American Jews had no access to Hebrew?
I think we know that, don't we? It's pretty much what's happened.
Well, are you saying that in the whole world, including Israelis and all Jews, or?
Yes.
Yeah, for parents that keep secrets from the kids.
I personally think that would be pretty bad. Hebrew language is, I mean, it's holy. It's what like the Torah is written in. I think there's so much you lose trying to understand the Torah and even like rabbinic stuff, like when you don't have Hebrew like at all. I feel like, and I still feel like when I'm reading, I mean, I'm not fluent in Hebrew either, so I know there's a lot that I'm missing just by looking at translations and being so reliant on them. So I don't know. I feel like we would lose a lot of culture and poetry if we like totally lost access to Hebrew entirely, like as a society.
Because the words aren't the same. the same sense in one language and the other, certainly not the same. I don't know enough about Hebrew, but I can tell you from, again, going my experience between English and Spanish, if I'm going to be reading a Spanish author that's well known, for example, I tell my wife, do not get the English version. You read it in Spanish. There's a difference in any language. There's a difference in the culture and the meaning from and the vocabulary, even from one language to the other. It's sometimes you just can't translate it literally. So you'll miss something, I'm sure.
Right? Yeah.
I think also there's a cultural component to language, because, and I've been thinking about this specifically lately because of English. I study several languages, so I speak a few, and so I'm always thinking of culture and language and that sort of thing. So, and I think there's a cultural component because in any language there is, and it harkens to what Charles was just saying. In any language, there are colloquial phrases and those sorts of things that are used that everybody knows and understands. And it's also why we have differences even in English between people in the UK or Australia or even India, because India really is also an English speaking country, but with their own version of English. And I kind of became aware of this when I was leading, international projects at IBM, because I'm an American and I use this phrase, who's next, who's up to bat next, or something. I use baseball terms a lot. And I became, nobody said anything to me, but I became aware that, oh, wait a minute, I've got people in India who probably have no clue, and people in the UK who have no clue what I'm referring to. When I use these, or I'd say, who's in the batter's box, or something like that. And so we have, and lately I've been thinking about the phrase 2 bits. I'm not sure anybody outside the US knows what 2 bits are, or even knows the song, a shave and a haircut, 2 bits. So hearkening back to Hebrew, that's also a cultural language, and culture unites people in thought. And so I'll just leave it at that.
Well, my daughter who's visiting is listening to this, and her comment about this was, if we had no access to Hebrew, we would lose our identity. That's her thought.
Idioms cannot be translated verbatim from one language to another because they just lose their meaning entirely.
I just wanted to say that I had looked at the Rashi because I wanted to know what he said about chapter 10 and chapter 11. He doesn't comment on that, but he says the one language was, of course, the Lashon Kodesh. It was the holy language. It was Hebrew. That's what he assumes that. And then he has a problem with the other part of that sentence about the one speech. I'm not sure how your translation goes, the one set of words, because he doesn't want to have it. He can't. It can't be redundant because it's the Bible. It's the Torah. So he says they came with one counsel. So that shows the looking for a way of understanding that as meaning the people shared this language and and they had the same idea of what to do. Pardon me.
But the spoken language apparently in ancient times was Aramaic more than Hebrew, so it couldn't have been Aramaic for the Tower of Babel. I don't know. I'm just throwing that out.
I think Aramaic was a later development. Because we see Aramaic in later parts of the Bible, but not in earlier parts.
Okay.
All right. Other thoughts about Act 1 before we move to Act 2? Okay, if you have thoughts, you'll email me. Joseph, would you read Act 2, please?
Came down to look at the city and tower that humanity had built. And Adonai said, if as one people with one language for all, this is how they have begun to act, then nothing that they may propose to do will be out of their reach. Let us then go down and confound their speech there, so that they shall not understand one another's speech. Thus, Adonai scattered them from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. This is why it was called Babel, because there Adonai confounded the speech of the whole earth. Or from there, Adonai scattered them over the face of the whole earth.
Okay.
Context. This is the next part of the story. Rashi points out that because here humanity works together in contradiction to human on human violence in Noah's time, these people were dispersed while those people were killed. Note that all Babel is also the Hebrew word for Babylonian, and that the Hebrew word for confound, Balal, is similar to Babel.
Mm-hmm.
This may be poking fun at the Babylonian interpretation of the term Babel, which they translated as gate to God.
Thank you. All right, so at what points could this part of the story have turned out differently?
One could imply that since Babylonian and Babel were the same word, perhaps Babylonians didn't all speak one language to begin with.
As a cosmopolitan city, they probably attracted people from a number of areas and eventually conquered people from a number of areas who spoke different languages. So that would make sense.
So I have a question that says, and I'm talking way too much tonight, but you stimulated my curiosity more than other evenings. How were they acting that was annoying to the heavens? They're building this tower, and they're doing it so they're not losing sight of who they are, but as a public works project for economic development, I'm sensing that it's something we shouldn't be doing. So we shouldn't have public works projects today, or how am I to understand this? What am I missing?
Welcome to the conversation, Charles. You have asked the question that people who take the time to stop and think about the story have been pondering for the last 2,000 plus years. What on earth did they do wrong that caused the issues that caused God to be upset? So there are a number of midrashic answers, but everybody's working off the same text.
They don't have to be doing anything wrong if you realize that when you see a group of people doing something down the block and you don't know exactly what they're doing, you get suspicious of what they might be doing. Could God be getting suspicious without really knowing what they had in mind?
Yeah, but then the question is, what did they have in mind that they were doing? What lesson do we learn how we shouldn't or should not behave?
I guess we shouldn't all go and migrate to New York.
Maybe it's not good to build more. We should have more of a Jeffersonian type of a society, more agricultural rather than urban, with concentrations of power in metropolitan areas.
That is actually what a number of people have proposed, that this is an anti-urbanization story.
All the evils that come from being concentrated in the city. I don't know. I'm just throwing out ideas just to stir the pot.
Sort of building off some of that, David, has anyone traditionally thought that the tower itself was the problem rather than the city they were building around it?
Most people do. Most of the classic commentators think that the tower was a bigger threat to God, or more concerning to God, than the city. Because they look at it saying that they're trying to build a tower with its top in the sky, and then they see after that God comes down and does look at the city, but also the tower, and says, something here, there's something going on here I don't like. And so if God is coming down, then it is presumed that God is up, as in up in the heavens. And if the tower is going up towards the sky, then the tower is the thing that is getting closer to God. And so the classic commentators tend to assume that God is more concerned about the tower. Modern scholars who look at the story in historical context tend to think that it might be more of an issue because of the city and less because of the tower, and that the tower was put into the story because Babylon had a ziggurat, which was a tower.
So would that first group of people you just were referring to feel it'd be better to have a bunch of small synagogues than one huge synagogue?
I think they would say that if God had given, that if there were only Jews on earth and they were all in one place, and God told them, go fill the earth, then first you ought to go make a bunch of synagogues all over the place, and then you should worry about trying to make your synagogues bigger.
Okay.
When you was saying that God had came down, I was thinking about was he kind of I guess displeased with the intentions of their ingenuity, like their technology, basically, like in the purpose and what they the purpose and the reason for why they are building the tower.
So you're proposing a question of, is it different? You're differentiating the technology, in this case bricks, from how the technology is being used.
Real like the intention behind why they are building what they're building. Just like now they're building robots and all different type of things. Like, what's the true intentions behind it that make it, I would say, wicked or something?
Yes, that's certainly one possibility, and that opens up all sorts of practical relevances to today, like AI and genetic modification and all sorts of things about, like, what are you building, why are you building it, and how could it be used besides the reason that you're building it. Yeah, that's certainly a possibility.
I wonder if it had to do with the fact that the people were able to organize themselves to build this structure, and that they figured it out, where it wasn't, until later in the Bible where God gives them a plan, to build a sanctuary, and he gave them direction to build it, and they built it. So here they're building something without any direction from above. And so really, what was the purpose of building this tower? It wasn't to glorify God, it was to glorify themselves.
To make a name for ourselves, yeah. So, was it a punishment to have different languages?
Considering what not understanding everybody leads to, maybe it was.
And I guess was it
people understand each other?
Was it a short-term punishment, and was it a long-term punishment?
I'd say longer term.
Yeah.
All right. So, recognizing the time, I want to show you what else is in the source sheet that you can then look at for yourselves. And it's worth noting that the reason that we're studying this story this week is because it comes up in this week's Parshat Noach. And if you're in a community where they do a triennial reading, where they only read 1/3 of the Parsha each week, this cycle, 2024 to 2025, or 57 to 85, is the third triennial cycle. So we will be reading this story in shul this week, pretty much everybody, no matter how much Torah reading you're doing. So we got in Act 1, there are 10 questions, of which we got through the first 5. In Act 2, there are 10 questions, of which we got to like 2 of them. There is a New Yorker cover. Here it is black and white. Here it is in color, from 1995. There's a board game about Babel. It's part of the 7 Wonders of the World series. Here's a video from Godcast about why we build. Here's a Bible rap. Matt Barr does a number of wonderful Bible raps, and this is one that he did. Here's someone trying to create archaeological evidence about this. We also have historical origins of the story. Mesopotamian analogs. So in this neighborhood in Mesopotamia, there are other versions of the story, just like there are about the Noah's Ark story. So you'll read this on your own. Henry David Thoreau has something to say about the Tower of Babel, kind of. So you can look at that. Here's a script. If you want to see this as a play, 2-act play. You have the full story. It's not terribly long. And then a whole slew of midrashim about the Tower of Babel, mostly trying to answer the question of what was so wrong that God got upset about this. Lots and lots of answers to that question. You know, for only 9 verses, there's a lot of commentary on this. So, I'll stop the recording.